People see the ending and think they understand the story. They see the photographs, the headlines, the scholarship ceremony, the billionaire family standing beside my son. They see the smiles and assume everything was always destined to work out. They don't see the years before that. They don't see the bills stacked on the kitchen counter. They don't see the nights I spent lying awake wondering how I was going to pay for Ethan's future. Most of all, I found it 15 years ago wrapped inside a blanket beside Ethan when he was a baby. There had been no note, no explanation, just the metal. I always assumed it belonged to whoever left him there. Every few years I'd suggest storing it somewhere safe. Ethan always refused. It stays with me. I never argued. Something about that metal mattered to him. Even if neither of us knew why. Saturday arrived faster than expected. We borrowed a suit from a neighbor for me, held it toward the camera. My stomach tightened immediately. The folder carried government seals, classified markings, multiple warning labels. Then Hannah smiled. This is, complete silence followed. Then she opened the folder. Photographs appeared. Grainy, old, disturbing. Men in military uniforms. Scientists. Politicians. Secret facilities. Then, one image filled the screen. My blood turned to ice. Because standing among them was a young Richard Sterling. Then another figure appeared beside him. A younger Helen Cross. And another man. Someone nobody in the ballroom recognized. Then Michael Sterling's face suddenly changed. Completely changed. No, silence. What? Victoria asked. Michael stared at the image. I know him. The room froze. Then Michael leaned closer to the screen. That's Thomas Whitmore. My pulse accelerated. Charles Whitmore's father. Then Hannah nodded. Correct. Another pause. Founder of Harbor 7. Complete silence. Then Hannah continued. Charles inherited more than money. Another pause. He inherited secrets. Suddenly the entire conspiracy seemed much larger. Then a federal agent's phone rang again. He answered immediately. His expression darkened. Sir? Silence. How many? Another pause. Already? My stomach tightened. Then the agent slowly lowered the phone. The stock market. Nobody understood. Then he continued. Sterling Industries just lost $12 billion in value. The ballroom erupted. Investors shouted. Executives panicked. Phones appeared everywhere. Richard looked exhausted. Victoria looked sick. Then Hannah smiled. That's only the beginning. My pulse exploded. Because she wasn't interested in exposing the truth. She wanted destruction. Then Hannah opened another file. Let's talk about Michael. The room instantly went silent again. Michael stared at the screen. What about me? Hannah's smile widened. You spent 15 years believing Charles Whitmore wanted you dead. Another pause. He did. Silence. Complete silence. Then she added, but he wasn't the one who ordered it. My blood turned to ice. Every head turned toward Richard Sterling. The old billionaire looked horrified. No, Hannah laughed softly. Not him either. Then she slowly lifted a final photograph from the folder. My pulse stopped, because the image showed Michael Sterling standing beside someone at the ferry terminal 15 years earlier. Someone hidden in the background. Someone nobody had noticed before. Then the camera zoomed in. The ballroom froze. Victoria's face instantly lost all color. Grace gasped. Richard nearly collapsed. Because the person standing behind Michael that night wasn't Charles Whitmore. It wasn't Richard Sterling. It wasn't a stranger. It was Victoria Sterling, 15 years younger, standing at the ferry terminal just hours before her brother disappeared. Then Hannah delivered the sentence that shattered the entire room. Your brother's disappearance began with a secret. Another pause. That Victoria has been hiding for 15 years. The ballroom went completely silent, because for the first time since this nightmare began, every finger was pointing at the CEO herself. The ballroom went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Every eye turned toward Victoria Sterling. The billionaire CEO stood frozen beneath the giant screen. 15 years of confidence vanished from her face in an instant. My pulse hammered against my ribs, because the photograph hanging above the crowd was impossible to ignore. There she was, 15 years younger. Standing at the ferry terminal hours before Michael disappeared, Then Hannah Cross smiled. Well? Silence. Complete silence. Would you like to tell them? Victoria looked genuinely stunned. I don't even remember that photograph. Hannah laughed softly. Of course you do. Richard Sterling suddenly stepped forward. Enough. His voice echoed across the ballroom. Hannah's smile faded slightly. Then Richard looked directly at his daughter. Tell them. Victoria froze. Completely froze. Grace stared at her mother. Mom? The room held its breath. Then Victoria closed her eyes. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, she whispered. Michael was leaving. Silence. Complete silence. Then she looked up. Tears filled her eyes. That night, another pause. I begged him not to go. The ballroom remained silent. Then Michael's voice came through the screen. Calm. Sad. It's true. Everyone turned toward him. Michael stared at his sister. You followed me to the ferry. Victoria nodded slowly. Because I was scared. Another pause. Found a second-hand tuxedo for Ethan. Not perfect, not even close, but respectable. At least I thought so. Then we arrived at the Sterling Grand Hotel. The place looked like a palace. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Valets rushed everywhere. Crystal chandeliers glowed through enormous windows. Wealth practically leaked from the walls. Ethan adjusted his tie. You nervous? I asked. He nodded immediately. Terrified. I laughed. Good. Silence. Why is that good? I smiled. Means you care. You wouldn't tell me where you were going. Then Michael smiled sadly. Because I was protecting you. The room froze. Then Hannah immediately interrupted. Protecting her from what? Michael's expression darkened. For the first time all night, he looked angry, truly angry. Then he stared directly at Hannah. You. Complete silence. Hannah's smile vanished. Then Michael continued. Not Charles. Another pause. Not Richard. Another pause. You. My blood turned to ice. Because suddenly the story changed again. Then Victoria whispered. What? Michael looked toward the camera. The person who arranged the attack wasn't Charles Whitmore. Silence. He financed it. Another pause. But someone else planned it. The room froze. Then Michael slowly pointed at Hannah Cross. Her. Complete silence swallowed the ballroom. Hannah didn't deny it, didn't argue, didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she laughed, softly, calmly, dangerously. Then she folded her arms. Very good. My stomach dropped immediately. Because guilty people normally fought accusations. Hannah seemed proud of them. Then Richard whispered, Why? Hannah looked toward him. 30 years of resentment flashed across her face. Because you chose the wrong sister. The room froze. Helen Cross closed her eyes, as if she'd heard those words before. Then Hannah continued. 40 years ago. Another pause. I built Harbor 7 with you. Another pause. I sacrificed everything. Then her voice hardened, and when it became profitable, silence. You handed everything to Helen. Richard looked devastated. That's not what happened. Hannah laughed. It never is. Then she opened another file. More photographs appeared on the screen. Harbor 7. Sterling executives. Government contracts. Then dozens of signatures. My pulse accelerated. Because one name appeared repeatedly. Hannah Cross. Then another. Richard Sterling. Then suddenly they stopped, replaced by Helen Cross. Hannah smiled bitterly. I built the empire. Another pause. She inherited it. The ballroom remained silent. Then Grace stepped forward. So you tried to kill Uncle Michael? Hannah looked at her. Then smiled sadly. No. Silence. I tried to stop him. Nobody liked that answer. Then Michael laughed bitterly through the screen. By blowing up a ferry? Hannah said nothing. Which was answer enough. Then another voice suddenly echoed across the ballroom. Actually, everyone froze. Because the voice wasn't coming from the screen. It came from the ballroom entrance. My pulse stopped. Slowly, every head turned. The massive doors had opened. Federal agents filled the hallway. Reporters rushed aside. Security guards stepped back. Then a man walked inside, mid-60s, gray beard, weathered face, limp in his left leg. The room froze. Completely froze. Because Richard Sterling immediately started crying. No. Silence. No way. Victoria covered her mouth. Grace gasped. My blood turned to ice. Because somehow Hannah looked terrified. Truly terrified. Then the stranger spoke. You always did love rewriting history. Complete silence followed. Then Richard whispered the impossible name. Captain Lewis. The room froze. Because according to every official record, Captain Samuel Lewis had died aboard the ferry 15 years ago. Yet there he stood, alive. Then Captain Lewis slowly removed a worn leather folder from beneath his arm. Michael didn't survive the ferry alone. Silence. Complete silence. Then he opened the folder. Hundreds of pages filled with witness statements, maintenance reports, and photographs. The original investigation. The real investigation. Then he looked directly at Hannah. Would you like me to tell them what really happened that night? Hannah's face instantly lost all color. Completely. Because for the first time in 15 years, someone had finally returned with the truth. The ballroom went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Captain Samuel Lewis stood in the center of the room holding a worn leather folder. 15 years earlier, the world believed he had died aboard the ferry alongside dozens of passengers. Yet there he was, older, scarred, limping slightly, but very much alive. My pulse hammered in my ears, because judging by Hannah Cross's face, she never expected to see him again. Then Captain Lewis smiled. Hello, Hannah. We walked inside together. The ballroom was breathtaking. Hundreds of guests, politicians, executives, celebrities, students from across the country. Every person looked richer than the last. Ethan immediately seemed smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally, out of place. I hated that feeling because I knew it well. Then an announcer's voice echoed across the ballroom. Please welcome Victoria Sterling. The room erupted into applause. Every head turned toward the grand staircase. Complete silence followed. Hannah stared at him. Her confidence had vanished, completely vanished. Then she whispered, Impossible. Captain Lewis laughed softly. That's exactly what Michael said when he saw me. The ballroom froze. Then Michael's image on the giant screen nodded slowly. He saved my life. Silence. Complete silence. Then Captain Lewis held up the leather folder. And I've been waiting 15 years to return this. My stomach tightened immediately, because whatever was inside had Hannah terrified. Then Richard Sterling stepped forward. What happened that night? Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Captain Lewis opened the folder. Inside sat hundreds of pages, reports, witness statements, photographs, audio transcripts, everything the official investigation never saw. Then he removed a photograph. The giant screen automatically displayed it. My blood turned to ice, because it showed the ferry hours before departure. Then another image appeared. Cargo containers being loaded aboard. Nothing unusual, until Captain Lewis pointed toward one specific container. There. Silence. What about it? Victoria asked. The captain's expression hardened. It wasn't cargo. Complete silence followed. Then another photograph appeared. This one taken from a different angle. My pulse accelerated, because several armed men stood near the container. Then another image. Then another. Then another. The room slowly began to understand. The container carried explosives. The ballroom erupted. Reporters shouted. Federal agents exchanged shocked looks. Grace covered her mouth. Then Captain Lewis continued. The ferry wasn't sabotaged at sea. Another pause. It left the dock already rigged to explode. Hannah looked ready to collapse. Then Captain Lewis turned toward her. Would you like to tell them who authorized the shipment? Silence. Complete silence. Hannah didn't answer. Then Michael's voice came through the screen. She won't. Another pause. I already know. The room froze. Then Michael slowly held up a document of his own. An original shipping manifest. Signed. Authorized. Approved. Hannah Cross. My blood ran cold. Then Victoria whispered, Why? Hannah laughed bitterly. Because your brother wouldn't stop. Silence. Complete silence. Then Hannah pointed toward Michael on the screen. He found everything. Another pause. Harbor 7. Another pause. The contracts. Another pause. The money. Another pause. The prisoners. Her voice hardened. He was going to expose all of it. The room froze. Then Richard stepped forward. Tears streamed down his face. "So you murdered innocent people?" Hannah looked at him, truly looked at him. Then she smiled sadly. "No." Another pause. "I failed to stop the explosion." Complete silence. Nobody liked that answer. Then Captain Lewis laughed, not because anything was funny, because the lie was insulting. Then he removed one final document from the folder. My pulse exploded immediately, because this wasn't a report. It was a confession. Handwritten, signed, dated. Then he handed it directly to a federal agent. The agent read the first paragraph. His face instantly lost all color. Then the second. Then the third. Then he slowly looked up. Oh my God. Silence. Complete silence. Then Victoria stepped forward. "What is it?" The agent swallowed hard. "This confession isn't from Hannah Cross." The room froze. Then he continued. "It's from Charles Whitmore." My stomach dropped. Because Charles had already been arrested. Then the agent read aloud. "The explosion aboard the Sterling Star was never intended to kill Michael Sterling." Complete silence. Then another line. "The objective was to eliminate the real threat." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Victoria whispered, "Who?" The federal agent continued reading. "Target, Victoria Sterling." The ballroom exploded. Grace screamed. Richard staggered backward. Michael froze on the screen. My pulse stopped, because suddenly the entire story changed. Again, then the agent kept reading. Michael Sterling discovered the plot and switched places with his sister hours before departure. The room froze. Then Victoria covered her mouth. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "No." Captain Lewis nodded slowly. "It's true." Another pause. "Your brother saved your life." The room went completely silent. Then Michael smiled sadly through the screen. "You always were the favorite." Victoria started crying. Real crying. The kind that comes from 15 years of grief crashing into one moment. Then Michael's smile disappeared. He looked toward Hannah. The problem was silence. The explosion happened anyway. Complete silence followed. Then another voice suddenly echoed through the ballroom speakers. Calm. Familiar. Dangerous. Not exactly. A woman descended slowly. Elegant black gown. Perfect posture. Absolute confidence. Victoria Sterling. Even from a distance, you could feel the authority around her. People moved when she moved, listened when she spoke. The kind of person who controlled entire industries before breakfast. Then something unexpected happened. Her daughter appeared beside her, Grace Sterling. 17 years old, smart eyes, warm smile, much friendlier than her mother. The crowd applauded again. My blood turned to ice, because everyone recognized the voice immediately. Charles Whitmore. The room froze. Federal agents grabbed their radios. Then every screen in the ballroom flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Classed. A new live feed appeared. My pulse exploded, because Charles Whitmore was standing inside Harbor 7's Central Archive, surrounded by stacks of documents. Somehow, impossibly, he had escaped federal custody. Then Charles smiled directly into the camera. You've all been chasing the wrong villain. Complete silence. Then he lifted a thick black file. The oldest file in Harbor 7. The one everyone thought had been destroyed decades ago. Then Charles delivered the sentence that shattered the entire room. If you really want the truth. Another pause. Ask Ethan Carter, who his mother actually was. The ballroom froze. Completely froze. Because standing beside me, Ethan slowly lowered his head. And for the first time since this story began, he looked terrified. The ballroom froze, completely froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Every screen displayed Charles Whitmore standing inside Harbor 7's Central Archive. The oldest secrets in Sterling history surrounded him. Yet nobody was looking at Charles anymore. Every eye had turned toward Ethan. My pulse hammered in my ears. Because for the first time all night, my son looked afraid. Truly afraid. Then Victoria whispered, What is he talking about? Silence. Complete silence. Ethan slowly lowered his eyes, then looked at me. My stomach dropped instantly, because there was something in his expression I had never seen before. Recognition. Not confusion. Recognition. Then Charles smiled through the screen. There it is. Another pause. He remembers. The room froze. Remembers what? Grace asked. Nobody answered. Then Michael's voice came through the screen from his mountain cabin. Charles. Silence. Leave him out of this. Charles laughed softly. Impossible. Another pause. He's the reason this story exists. My pulse exploded. Because suddenly everything felt connected. The metal. The missing will. Michael. Harbor 7. My son. Then Charles opened the black file. Hundreds of documents filled the screen. Birth records, hospital files, government seals, photographs. Then a single image appeared. My blood turned to ice, because it showed a woman holding a newborn baby. The woman was instantly recognizable, even after all these years. Sarah Carter, Ethan's mother. My late wife. The room froze. Then Grace whispered, "That's Ethan's mom." Silence. Complete silence. Then Charles nodded. Correct. Another pause. Now let's use her real name. My stomach dropped, because suddenly I knew. Somehow, I knew. Then another document appeared. Sarah Sterling. The ballroom exploded. Richard Sterling staggered backward. Victoria covered her mouth. Michael froze completely. My pulse stopped. Sarah Sterling. Not Sarah Carter, Sarah Sterling. Then Victoria whispered, "No." Another pause. "No way." Michael looked devastated. Then he closed his eyes. I knew it. Complete silence swallowed the room. Then every head turned toward him. Victoria stared at her brother through the screen. "You knew?" Michael nodded slowly. Tears filled his eyes. Not at first. Another pause. But eventually, the room froze. Then Michael looked toward Ethan. Sarah was my daughter. My vision blurred. Everything seemed to stop moving. Because if Sarah was Michael's daughter, then Ethan wasn't connected to the Sterling family by coincidence. He was family. Then Victoria started crying. "Sarah?" Michael nodded slowly. "My daughter." Another pause. "Your niece." The ballroom fell silent again. Then Richard Sterling sat down heavily. Tears streamed down his face. Dear God. My pulse hammered so hard it hurt, because suddenly Ethan wasn't just some scholarship student who happened to own an old medal. He was Michael Sterling's grandson, Richard Sterling's great-grandson, Victoria's grandnephew. Then Ethan whispered, "Mom never told me." Michael smiled sadly. "She didn't tell anyone." Another pause. "Because she wanted you protected." Silence followed. Then Charles laughed through the screen. "Protected?" Another pause. "From what?" Nobody answered. Then Charles held up another photograph, this one much older. My blood turned to ice immediately. Then the gala officially began. For about 30 minutes, everything went perfectly. Ethan spoke with scholarship coordinators, met other students, even relaxed a little. I started thinking maybe we'd survive the night after all. Then one of the waiters accidentally bumped into Ethan. Not hard. Just enough to spill a small amount of sparkling water onto his jacket. Nothing serious. The problem was what happened next. Ethan instinctively reached for a napkin, because it showed Harbor 7 40 years ago. Then another image appeared. A list of names, prisoners, witnesses, political dissidents. Then another, families, children, relatives, hidden identities. My pulse accelerated, because one name appeared near the bottom. Sarah Sterling. Then another line beneath it. Relocation approved. Identity changed. Then the truth finally emerged. Sarah had spent her entire life hiding. Not from criminals. Not from debt. From Harbor 7. Then Michael nodded slowly. She discovered the truth. Another pause. Everything. Another pause. The prisoners. Another pause. The disappearances. Another pause. The money. The room froze. Then Michael's voice cracked. And she paid for it. Complete silence followed. Then I whispered, "The cancer." Michael slowly shook his head. My blood turned cold. What? Michael closed his eyes. Tears rolled down his face. It wasn't cancer. The room exploded. Victoria gasped. Grace looked horrified. Richard froze. Even the federal agents stopped moving. Then Michael delivered the sentence that shattered every remaining illusion. Sarah was murdered. Complete silence swallowed the ballroom. My knees nearly gave out, because for 11 years I had believed my wife died from illness. Then Charles nodded through the screen. Now we're finally telling the truth. My pulse exploded. Then another voice suddenly echoed across every monitor. Calm, cold, familiar. No. The room froze. Every screen flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a woman appeared. Elegant silver hair, expensive black coat, sharp eyes. Hannah Cross. My blood turned to ice, because she wasn't in Harbor 7 anymore. She stood inside a private helicopter, engines roaring behind her. Then she smiled. You're still missing the most important part. Silence. Complete silence. Then Hannah lifted a sealed envelope, old, yellowed, weathered by time. My stomach dropped immediately, because Michael recognized it. Richard recognized it. Helen recognized it. The missing letter. Michael Sterling's final letter from 15 years ago. The one Richard claimed to have burned. Then Hannah smiled directly at Ethan. Would you like to know what your mother was protecting? The room froze. Then she slowly opened the envelope, pulled out a single sheet of paper. Read one line, and everything changed. To my family, another pause. If anything happens to me, the child must never learn who he really is. Complete silence followed. Then Hannah looked directly into the camera, directly at Ethan, and delivered the sentence that made the entire ballroom stop breathing. Because Ethan Carter isn't the last heir to the Sterling fortune. Another pause. He's the sole legal owner of it. The ballroom stopped breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every screen displayed Hannah Cross standing inside a helicopter holding Michael Sterling's missing letter. My pulse hammered against my ribs, because the sentence she had just spoken changed everything. Ethan Carter wasn't simply connected to the Sterling family. According to the letter, he owned it. The entire room froze. Richard Sterling stared at the screen in disbelief. Victoria looked like she might collapse. Grace covered her mouth. Michael sat motionless inside the mountain cabin. Even the federal agents seemed stunned. Then Hannah smiled. Now you understand. Silence. Complete silence. Then she raised the letter. Michael's final instructions. Another pause. His final protection. Another pause. His final mistake. My stomach tightened immediately. Then Michael's voice echoed through the ballroom. Calm. Firm. Read the rest. Hannah hesitated. Just for a second, then Michael smiled. Go ahead. Complete silence followed. Hannah slowly looked down at the page. Her confidence began to fade. Then she continued reading. The Sterling Valor Medal shall identify the heir. Another pause. The accompanying trust shall remain inaccessible until verified by 3 witnesses. The room froze. Then Richard whispered, 3 witnesses. Michael nodded. Me. Another pause. Helen. Another pause. And Richard. My pulse accelerated, because suddenly Hannah looked worried. Then Michael smiled sadly. You should have finished reading before making threats. The ballroom remained silent. Then Hannah's eyes moved farther down the page. Her expression instantly changed, completely. Then she lowered the letter. No. Michael nodded slowly. Yes. Another pause. Read it. Hannah didn't move. Then Michael spoke the next line from memory. If my descendant is ever identified. Another pause. The chain around his neck slipped free. The silver medal fell into view, hanging against his shirt. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sterling froze. Completely froze. My stomach tightened immediately, because the look on her face wasn't curiosity. It wasn't confusion. It was shock. Pure shock. Then the glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the marble floor. All ownership rights immediately transfer into a charitable trust controlled by independent trustees. Complete silence followed. Then Victoria's eyes widened. Grace gasped. Richard looked stunned. My stomach dropped, because suddenly Ethan wasn't inheriting billions. Then Michael smiled. The company doesn't belong to any individual. Another pause. It belongs to the Scholarship Foundation. The ballroom exploded. Reporters shouted. Investors stared at their phones. Board members looked horrified. Then Michael continued. The profits fund students. Another pause. Research. Another pause. Hospitals. Another pause. Veterans. The room froze. Then Richard started crying. Real tears. Then he laughed. That's exactly what you would do. Michael smiled. I know. Hannah's face twisted with fury, because after 15 years of manipulation, after all the secrets, all the lies, all the crimes, there was nothing left for her to steal. Then federal agents suddenly appeared behind her inside the helicopter. My pulse exploded. Hannah spun around. Too late. The helicopter door opened. Agents moved in. The letter slipped from her hand. Then the transmission cut out. Just like that, Hannah Cross was arrested. Silence swallowed the ballroom. For the first time all night, nobody knew what to say. Then Michael looked toward Ethan. Not at the heir, not at the owner, not at the center of a billion-dollar story, at his grandson. Then Michael smiled. Your mother would be proud of you. Ethan's eyes filled with tears immediately. Mine did too. Then Ethan whispered, I never got to say goodbye. Michael nodded slowly. Neither did I. Complete silence followed. Then Richard stood up. Slowly, carefully, like an old man carrying decades of regret. He walked across the ballroom until he stood directly in front of Ethan. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Richard Sterling, billionaire founder of one of the largest corporations in America, did something nobody expected. He apologized. I'm sorry. Silence. For Sarah. Another pause. For Michael. Another pause. For everything. Ethan looked at him for several seconds, then nodded. Nothing more, nothing less. It was enough. Then Victoria stepped forward, tears still streaming down her face. She looked at Ethan, then at me. I owe both of you an apology. My pulse tightened. Then she smiled weakly. And probably a scholarship. The ballroom laughed for the first time all night. Even Ethan. Then Michael's image appeared on the giant screen one final time. He looked toward Richard, toward Victoria, toward Grace, finally toward Ethan. I think it's time I came home. The room erupted into applause. 1 year later, Michael Sterling returned publicly. Harbor 7's secrets were fully exposed. Charles Whitmore received multiple life sentences. Hannah Cross spent the rest of her life behind bars. Helen Cross helped investigators uncover decades of hidden records. Richard Sterling stepped down from business permanently and devoted his remaining years to repairing the damage he helped create. Victoria transformed Sterling Industries into one of the largest charitable foundations in the country. The Sterling Scholars Program expanded nationwide. Thousands of students received opportunities they never would have had otherwise. And Ethan? Ethan received the first Michael Sterling Legacy Scholarship. He didn't take ownership of the company. He didn't want power. He didn't want billions. He wanted something much city-ting. A future. The same thing his mother had wanted for him all along. On a warm spring afternoon, exactly 1 year after the gala, Ethan stood on a stage accepting an award while hundreds of students applauded. Michael sat in the front row. Richard sat beside him. Victoria and Grace cheered louder than anyone, and I sat there watching my son. The boy I had raised. The boy who never knew he came from one of the richest families in America. The boy who remained exactly the same after learning the truth. Then Ethan looked toward me and smiled. The same smile he'd had since he was a child. In that moment, none of the money mattered. None of the secrets mattered. None of the inheritance mattered. Because family isn't about wealth. It isn't about bloodlines. It isn't about names written in wills. Family is the people who stay, the people who sacrifice, the people who love you when nobody is watching. 15 years earlier, a baby had been left with nothing but a blanket and a silver medal. 15 years later, that same boy reunited a broken family, exposed decades of corruption, and changed thousands of lives. The world called him an heir. The newspapers called him a billionaire. But to me, he would always be something much more important. My son. The sound of breaking glass echoed across the ballroom. Conversations stopped instantly. Music continued for a few seconds before the orchestra realized something was wrong. Then silence spread through the room. Hundreds of guests turned toward Victoria Sterling. The billionaire CEO stood frozen on the staircase. Crystal fragments surrounded her feet. Her eyes remained locked on one thing: Ethan's medal. My stomach tightened immediately, because people like Victoria Sterling didn't lose control. Not publicly, not ever. Yet the woman looked as if she had just seen a ghost. Ethan noticed too. His hand instinctively moved toward the medal hanging against his shirt. Then Victoria took a step forward, slowly, carefully, almost cautiously. The entire room watched. Nobody understood what was happening. Neither did we. Then Grace Sterling touched her mother's arm. "Mom?" Victoria didn't answer. Another step. Then another. Her eyes never left the medal. My pulse accelerated. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then one of the foundation directors approached her. "Victoria?" Silence. No response. Then she finally stopped a few feet from Ethan, close enough to see the details engraved into the worn silver surface, close enough to notice the scratches, the faded ribbon, the family crest carved into the back. The color drained from her face, completely. Then she whispered a single word: "Impossible." The room froze. Ethan looked confused. "Excuse me?" Victoria stared at him, then at the medal, then back at him. Her voice barely worked. "Where did you get that?" Silence. Complete silence. Every person in the ballroom seemed to lean closer. Ethan instinctively glanced toward me, then back at her. "I've had it my whole life." Victoria didn't blink. That's not an answer. Her tone wasn't rude. It wasn't angry. It sounded desperate, which somehow felt worse. Then Ethan slowly touched the medal. "My dad found it when I was a baby. They don't see the small silver medal hanging around my son's neck. The medal that changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Jack Carter. I'm 46 years old. I repair air conditioning systems for a living. Not glamorous work, not easy work, but honest work. The kind that keeps food on the table and the lights on at night. My son Ethan is 15. Smart kid, smarter than I ever was. The kind of student teachers remember." My pulse accelerated immediately, because I could see something changing behind Victoria's eyes. Then Grace stepped closer. "Mom?" Victoria ignored her. "Found it where?" Ethan looked uncomfortable. "I don't know." Silence. I was an infant. Then all at once, Victoria seemed to remember where she was. The ballroom, the guests, the cameras, the press. Her expression hardened instantly. The vulnerable look disappeared, replaced by something colder, safer, more familiar. Then she looked at Ethan's jacket, the slightly worn fabric, the second-hand tailoring, then at me, my borrowed suit, my scuffed shoes, my calloused hands, and suddenly the atmosphere changed, completely changed. My stomach dropped, because I recognized that look. Judgment. Then one of the board members leaned toward Victoria and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the reaction. Her expression darkened immediately. Then she looked back at Ethan. "Who invited you?" The question hit harder than it should have. Ethan frowned. "The foundation." Victoria folded her arms. "Really?" Silence. Then she turned toward an assistant. "Check the list." The assistant immediately pulled out a tablet. The ballroom remained silent. Every eye stayed fixed on us. Then the assistant hesitated. "His name is on the list." Victoria's jaw tightened. Another board member stepped forward. "Victoria, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Good advice." She ignored it. Then her eyes returned to the medal. Something about it clearly bothered her, deeply. But instead of asking more questions, she seemed to make a decision. The wrong one. Security. My pulse exploded. Ethan looked stunned. So did I. 2 security guards immediately approached. The room erupted into whispers. Grace looked confused. "Mom, what are you doing?" Victoria never looked away from us. "That medal belongs to my family." Complete silence. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. "And I believe it was stolen." The ballroom froze. Ethan's face lost all color. "What?" My stomach turned to ice. "Excuse me?" Victoria pointed toward the medal. That item disappeared 15 years ago. Another pause. It belongs to the Sterling family. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. I've had this my entire life. Victoria's expression remained cold. That doesn't change ownership. My pulse hammered against my ribs. Then the security guards stopped beside us. One looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Because even he knew this was going badly. Then Grace stepped between us. Mom. Silence. Stop. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Move. Grace didn't move. You're making a mistake. The room fell silent again. Then one of the older guests suddenly stood up. A man in his 70s, silver hair, expensive suit, sharp eyes. The entire ballroom immediately recognized him. Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Industries, Victoria's father, Grace's grandfather, one of the most powerful businessmen in America. My stomach tightened, because judging by his expression, he had heard everything. Then Richard slowly walked toward us. No rush, no panic, just quiet purpose. Victoria looked surprised. Dad. Richard ignored her completely. His eyes moved directly to Ethan, then to the medal. Then everything changed. The old man's face lost all color. Completely. His hands actually started shaking. The room froze. Because nobody had ever seen Richard Sterling shaken by anything. Then he whispered a name. A single name. Michael. Silence. Complete silence. Victoria stared at him. Dad? Richard didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the medal. Then he looked at Ethan. Really looked at him. Not his clothes. Not his background. Him. Then tears appeared in the old man's eyes. My pulse stopped. Because powerful men don't cry in public. Not unless something is very wrong. Then Richard slowly reached into his jacket pocket, removed an old photograph, and held it beside Ethan's face. The ballroom collectively stopped breathing, because the young man in the photograph looked almost exactly like him. The ballroom collectively stopped breathing. Richard Sterling stood motionless, holding an old photograph beside Ethan's face. My pulse hammered in my ears, because the resemblance wasn't small, it wasn't vague, it was shocking. The young man in the photograph had the same eyes, the same jawline, the same expression. 15 years separated the image from reality, yet it felt like looking at two versions of the same person. Silence filled the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The kind of kid who reads college textbooks for fun. I used to joke that he got all his brains from his mother. Ethan would laugh. Then we'd both get quiet. His mother died when he was 4. Cancer. Fast. Merciless. One year she was teaching middle school science. The next, she was gone. Since then, it's been just the two of us. We weren't poor exactly, but we lived carefully. Every dollar had a purpose. Every purchase had a discussion. Ethan never complained. That somehow made it harder. Then Grace Sterling stepped closer. Grandpa? Richard's hand trembled slightly. No. Another pause. This can't be happening. Victoria stared at the photograph, then at Ethan, then back at the photograph. Her face had gone completely pale. Dad. Silence. Where did you get that picture? Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes never left Ethan. Then he whispered. It was taken 2 weeks before Michael disappeared. The room froze. Complete silence. Michael Sterling. The missing son. The missing brother. The man whose name nobody in the Sterling family ever mentioned publicly. Ethan looked confused. Who is Michael? Richard slowly lowered the photograph. Tears filled his eyes. My son. Another pause. Victoria's brother. Ethan blinked. Then blinked again. I don't understand. Neither did I. Then Victoria suddenly stepped forward. Her cold corporate mask was beginning to crack. Where did your father find that medal? The question wasn't an accusation anymore. It sounded desperate. Ethan looked toward me. Every eye in the ballroom followed. My stomach tightened. Then I answered honestly. 15 years ago. Silence. I found Ethan outside street. Andrew's community church. The room froze. Victoria stared at me. Richard stared at me. Even the security guards seemed afraid to breathe. Then I continued. It was snowing. Another pause. He was wrapped in blankets. Another pause. The medal was tucked inside with him. Complete silence followed. Then Richard sat down heavily in the nearest chair, as if his legs had suddenly stopped working. Grace immediately rushed to him. "Grandpa?" The old man looked broken, truly broken. Then Victoria whispered, "No." Silence. "No, no, no." Another pause. "That's impossible." Then something unexpected happened. One of the guests stepped forward, a woman in her 60s, wearing an elegant navy suit. My pulse accelerated because the room immediately reacted to her. Important, powerful, familiar. Then Richard looked up. Helen. The woman nodded. Helen Cross, the Sterling family's longtime attorney, 40 years with the company, 40 years protecting their secrets. Then Helen stared at the medal. Her expression instantly changed. Dear God. Silence. Complete silence. Then she looked directly at Richard. "You still have the letter?" My stomach tightened immediately. Richard froze. Victoria froze. Even Helen seemed surprised she'd said it out loud. Then Victoria slowly turned toward her. "What letter?" Silence. Helen didn't answer. Big mistake. Then Victoria's voice hardened. "What letter?" Helen swallowed hard. "Richard." Silence. "Tell her." The old billionaire closed his eyes. The ballroom remained completely silent. Then Richard whispered, "I burned it." Every muscle in my body tightened. Victoria stared at him. "You burned what?" Richard looked 20 years older than he had 10 minutes earlier. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. The last letter Michael ever sent. The room froze. Complete silence. Grace looked stunned. "There was a letter?" Richard nodded slowly. Tears filled his eyes. 3 days before the ferry accident. Another pause. Michael mailed a letter home. Victoria stared at her father. "You never told me." Richard couldn't even look at her. Then Helen stepped forward. Because the letter contained instructions. My pulse accelerated. Victoria's face hardened. "Instructions for what?" Silence followed. Then Helen answered. "In case something happened to him." The room froze again. Then she looked directly at Ethan. Michael believed someone was trying to kill him. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The gala, the scholarship, the missing medal. Suddenly none of it mattered anymore. Then Victoria whispered, "What?" Helen nodded slowly. "He wrote that if he disappeared." Another pause. Certain people couldn't be trusted. My blood turned to ice. Because suddenly Michael Sterling's disappearance sounded very different. Then Richard stood up. Slowly, painfully. He looked directly at Ethan, then at the medal. Finally at Helen. The vault. Silence. Complete silence. Helen's face instantly lost color. "Richard." He ignored her. Then he turned toward Victoria. The letter wasn't the only thing Michael left behind. My pulse exploded. Victoria stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Richard took a shaky breath, then delivered the sentence that shattered the entire evening. "Your brother left a second will." The ballroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, shocked voices. The media photographers practically ran forward. Then Richard looked directly at Ethan. "And if that medal is genuine," another pause, "your son's name might be in it." The room froze. One Thursday evening I came home from work, covered in dust and insulation, after crawling through attics all day. My back hurt, my knees hurt, pretty sure even my soul hurt. Then I opened the front door and found Ethan standing in the kitchen holding a white envelope. His expression was strange. Excited. Nervous. Confused. "Dad." Silence. "What?" Ethan looked down at the envelope, then back at me. I think something crazy just happened. My stomach tightened immediately. Because standing in the back of the ballroom, hidden among the guests, a man in an expensive gray suit quietly pulled out his phone. He had been watching the entire conversation, listening to every word, waiting. Then he typed a single message, "Open the vault." And somewhere far from the gala, another phone immediately received it. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed forward. Guests whispered frantically. Board members exchanged nervous glances. Somewhere in the crowd, phones were already sending messages to journalists, investors, and lawyers. My pulse hammered against my ribs, because 15 minutes earlier, Ethan and I had been anonymous guests at a scholarship gala. Now one of the wealthiest families in America was staring at my son as if he had stepped out of a ghost story. Richard Sterling remained standing in the center of the room. His eyes never left Ethan. Then Victoria stepped closer. "Dad." Silence. "What second will?" Richard looked exhausted, truly exhausted, like a man carrying a burden for 15 years. Then he glanced toward Helen Cross. "Bring it." The attorney immediately froze. "Richard." His expression hardened. "Bring it." The room fell silent again, because everyone understood something important had just happened. Then Helen slowly nodded. "Very well." She reached into her purse and removed a small security key. My stomach tightened immediately. Then she looked toward Victoria. "There's a private archive beneath Sterling Tower." Another pause. Only 3 people knew it existed. Victoria stared at her. "You." Another pause. "My father." Another pause. "And Michael." Helen nodded. "Yes." Complete silence followed. Then Grace whispered, "You've been hiding this for 15 years?" Nobody answered, because the answer was obvious. Then Richard looked directly at Ethan. "Your medal." Silence. "May I see it?" Ethan hesitated. Understandably, the medal had been with him his entire life. The one thing connecting him to a past neither of us understood. Then slowly, he removed the chain from around his neck. The ballroom watched in complete silence. Richard accepted the medal with trembling hands. He turned it over, examined the back, then his breath caught. My stomach dropped, because engraved into the medal was something I had never noticed before. Tiny letters hidden beneath years of scratches. M.S. Michael Sterling. Richard closed his eyes. Tears immediately rolled down his face. "It's his." Complete silence. Victoria looked like she couldn't breathe. Grace covered her mouth. Then Richard carefully handed the medal back to Ethan. He never took it off. Another pause. "Never." The room froze. Then one of the board members stepped forward. A man in his 60s named Charles Whitmore. I'd noticed him earlier because he seemed unusually interested in everything happening. Expensive suit, perfect smile, sharp eyes. The kind of man who looked trustworthy until he spoke. Then Charles laughed softly. "With all due respect." Silence. "A medal proves nothing." My pulse accelerated. Richard slowly turned toward him. "Excuse me?" Charles folded his arms. "People lose things." Another pause. "Items get stolen." Another pause. "Finding an old medal doesn't suddenly make this boy part of the Sterling family." The ballroom immediately grew uncomfortable. Then Victoria frowned. "Charles." But he continued anyway. "We're talking about corporate succession, inheritance rights, and a missing will." Another pause. "Maybe we should verify facts before rewriting history." My stomach tightened, because despite sounding reasonable, something felt wrong. Then Helen Cross spoke. "The will verify everything." Charles smiled. "If it exists." Complete silence followed. Then Richard looked directly at him. "It exists." Charles said nothing. But for a split second, something flashed across his face. Fear, real fear. Then it disappeared. My pulse accelerated immediately, because suddenly Charles seemed much more interested in the missing will than anyone else in the room. Then, a security officer hurried into the ballroom. Breathless, nervous, he walked directly toward Helen, whispered something in her ear. The color instantly drained from her face, completely. "No." Silence. "What?" Richard demanded. Helen looked stunned. "The archive." Another pause. "There's been a break-in." The ballroom froze. Complete silence. Then Richard stepped forward. "When?" The security officer swallowed hard. "Approximately 20 minutes ago." My blood turned to ice, because 20 minutes ago was exactly when the conversation about Michael's will had started. Usually when a teenager says that, nothing good follows. Then he handed me the envelope. The seal on the front read, "Sterling Future Leaders Foundation." My pulse accelerated slightly. Everyone knew that name. Sterling Industries was one of the largest companies in America. Their CEO, Victoria Sterling, practically lived on business magazines. Billionaire, corporate legend, famous for being brilliant and impossible to impress. Then I opened the letter. Halfway through the first paragraph, then Victoria's expression hardened. "What was taken?" Silence followed. Then the officer answered. "We don't know yet." Another pause. The archive was professionally breached. My pulse exploded. Then Helen whispered, "Someone knew." Complete silence. Because there was only one way a thief could target a secret archive nobody knew existed. Someone had told them. Then Charles Whitmore immediately stepped forward. "This is exactly why we need to remain calm." Big mistake. Very big mistake. Because everyone suddenly looked at him, including Richard. Then Grace frowned. How did they know where the archive was? Nobody answered. Then Ethan spoke for the first time in several minutes. They didn't. Silence. Complete silence. Every head turned toward him. Ethan stared toward the ballroom entrance. His expression had changed. The same look he always got when solving a difficult problem. Then he repeated himself. They didn't know. Another pause. They were waiting. My stomach tightened. Waiting for what? Ethan looked directly at Charles Whitmore, then delivered the sentence that made the room go silent. For somebody to mention the will. Charles stopped smiling, for the first time all night. Then Ethan continued. The break-in happened 20 minutes ago. Another pause. Right after the will was discussed publicly. Complete silence. Then Richard slowly turned toward Charles. The old billionaire's eyes narrowed. Interesting. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Charles laughed softly. But this time it sounded forced. Are we really accusing people based on timing? Silence followed. Then a phone suddenly rang somewhere in the ballroom. Everyone jumped. Charles looked down. His face instantly lost all color. Because the ringing wasn't coming from his pocket. It was coming from the giant projection screen connected to the Gala's audio-visual system. Somehow, someone had hacked it. The screen flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a grainy security image appeared. My blood turned to ice. Because it showed a man entering the Sterling archive less than 30 minutes earlier. The image wasn't perfect. But it was clear enough to recognize the expensive gray suit, clear enough to recognize the face, clear enough to recognize Charles Whitmore. The ballroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, reporters, rushing forward, cameras flashing everywhere. Charles stared at the screen in horror. Then something even worse happened. A second image appeared, this one much older, 15 years older, a harbor security camera, a ferry terminal. The night Michael Sterling disappeared, the room froze, because standing beside Michael Sterling just hours before the accident was a much younger Charles Whitmore. The ballroom exploded. Reporters surged forward. Guests shouted over one another. Cameras flashed so rapidly it looked like lightning inside the hotel. My pulse hammered against my ribs, because the giant screen hanging above the stage displayed something nobody could ignore. 2 images, 15 years apart. In both of them stood the same man, Charles Whitmore. The respected board member, the trusted executive, the man currently standing 10 feet away from Richard Sterling looking like he'd just seen his own funeral. Complete silence followed the initial shock. Then Richard spoke. His voice was calm, too calm. Charles. Another pause. Explain. Charles stared at the screen. His face had gone completely pale. Then he laughed softly. The wrong laugh. The desperate laugh. Security footage? Another pause. That's your evidence? Nobody answered. Because unfortunately, it was pretty convincing evidence. Then the second image zoomed in automatically. My stomach tightened. Charles stood beside Michael Sterling on the ferry terminal dock. The timestamp clearly showed the night Michael disappeared. Then another image appeared. Different angle. Same night. Same dock. Same 2 men. The ballroom went silent again. Then Victoria whispered, "You knew." Charles slowly looked toward her. "Victoria." She cut him off immediately. "You knew where he was." Charles didn't answer. Big mistake. Then Richard took a step forward. "My son trusted you." Silence. Complete silence. Charles looked at the old billionaire. Then something changed. The fear disappeared, replaced by anger, real anger. Then he smiled. That's the problem. My stomach dropped immediately, because guilty people deny, dangerous people justify. Then Charles adjusted his jacket. Michael was weak. The room froze. Richard looked like he'd been punched. I stopped reading. "What?" Ethan asked. I looked at him, then back at the letter. Then at him again. You got it. Silence. Complete silence. Ethan stared. Got what? My voice barely worked. The invitation. Another pause. The Sterling Scholars Gala. Ethan blinked. Then blinked again. Wait. Another pause. The gala? I nodded slowly. Every year, the Sterling Foundation selected 10 students nationwide for a prestigious scholarship program. Thousands applied. Only 10 were invited. Victoria's face hardened instantly. Grace gasped. Then Charles continued. The company needed leadership. Another pause. Not idealism. My pulse accelerated, because suddenly nobody was talking about a missing person anymore. They were talking about motive. Then Charles pointed toward Ethan. You want the truth? Silence. Michael was going to destroy Sterling Industries. The ballroom remained completely silent. Then Helen Cross stepped forward. That's a lie. Charles laughed. Is it? Another pause. Ask Richard about the contracts. Richard's face instantly lost color. My stomach tightened. Then Charles looked around the room. Michael wanted to expose everything. Another pause. Government deals. Another pause. Defense contracts. Another pause. Political donations. The room grew uncomfortable. Then Charles smiled. Billions of dollars. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Richard whispered, Stop. Charles ignored him. Michael planned to walk away from all of it. Another pause. And take half the company with him. The ballroom froze. Then Victoria stared at her father. Is that true? Richard said nothing, which was answer enough. Then Ethan suddenly stepped forward. So you killed him? Complete silence. Every head turned toward him. Charles stared at the 15-year-old boy standing in front of hundreds of powerful adults. Another pause. I didn't kill Michael Sterling. The room froze, because somehow that sounded worse. Then Charles pointed toward the screen. Michael survived. Complete silence. The ballroom stopped breathing. Richard froze. Victoria froze. Grace froze. Even the reporters stopped talking. Then Richard whispered, What? Charles smiled slowly. That's right. Another pause. Your son survived the ferry accident. The room erupted. Shouts. Gasps. Chaos. My pulse exploded. Because suddenly the story changed completely. Michael wasn't dead. He wasn't missing. He was alive. Or at least had been. Then Victoria grabbed Charles by the arm. Where is he? Her voice cracked. Charles looked almost amused. You spent 15 years mourning him. Another pause. Maybe you should have looked harder. Richard looked ready to collapse. Then Helen stepped forward. Where is Michael? Charles finally hesitated. Just for a second. Then another voice answered before he could. Closer than you think. Every screen in the ballroom flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. The security footage vanished. The crowd froze. Then a live video feed appeared. My blood turned to ice, because it showed a small cabin somewhere in the mountains, snow outside, firelight inside. A man sat in a wooden chair facing away from the camera. Gray hair, broad shoulders, weathered hands. Then, slowly, he turned around. The ballroom went completely silent. Richard Sterling dropped to his knees. Victoria covered her mouth. Grace started crying instantly, because the man on the screen was unmistakable. Older, scarred, changed by time, but unmistakable. Michael Sterling was alive. Then he looked directly into the camera, directly at the family who thought he'd been dead for 15 years. Tears filled his eyes. Then he spoke 4 words. 4 words that shattered everything. Charles wasn't alone. Complete silence followed. Then Michael slowly held up a faded document. My pulse accelerated immediately, because I recognized the signature at the bottom, Richard Sterling. The old billionaire stared at the screen in horror. Then Michael delivered the sentence nobody in the ballroom was prepared to hear. Dad, another pause. You signed the order. The ballroom went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Richard Sterling remained on his knees staring at the giant screen. His son, his missing son, alive. After 15 years, tears streamed down the old billionaire's face. Victoria looked frozen. Grace was openly crying. Even the reporters seemed too shocked to speak. Then Michael Sterling repeated the words, "Dad." Another pause. "You signed the order." My pulse hammered against my ribs, because suddenly the miracle of finding Michael alive wasn't the biggest story anymore. The accusation was. Richard looked devastated. "No." His voice barely worked. "No." Michael stared back through the screen. "You don't remember?" Complete silence. Then Michael held up the document. The camera zoomed in. My stomach tightened immediately. Official Sterling Industries letterhead. Legal authorization. Executive signatures. And at the bottom, Richard Sterling's name. The ballroom froze. Most came from elite private schools, wealthy families, future politicians, future CEOs, not kids from our neighborhood, not kids whose fathers spent their days repairing broken air conditioners. Ethan grabbed the letter and reread it himself. Then he sat down. Hard. "No way." I laughed. "That's what I said." Then he looked up. "Dad." Silence. "What?" He smiled. The kind of smile I hadn't seen in a long time. "I actually did it." My chest tightened. Then Victoria whispered, "What order?" Michael's expression darkened. "The order that transferred control of the shipping division to Charles Whitmore." Another pause. 3 days before the ferry explosion, Charles immediately laughed. Too quickly, too loudly. "This is ridiculous." Nobody looked at him. Then Michael continued. "I tried to stop it." Another pause. "I discovered money disappearing through shell companies." Another pause. "Millions at first." Another pause. Then hundreds of millions. My stomach tightened, because the story sounded familiar. Very familiar. Then Michael looked directly at Richard. "I brought the evidence to you." Silence. "You promised to investigate." Richard looked shattered. Then Michael lowered his eyes. Instead, another pause. "The authorization was approved." Complete silence followed. Then Richard whispered, "I never knew." Michael froze. Victoria froze. Everyone froze. Then Richard slowly stood up. His hands were shaking. "I signed dozens of documents every day back then." Another pause. "Hundreds every month." Tears filled his eyes. Charles handled the approvals. My pulse accelerated. Then Helen Cross suddenly stepped forward. "He's telling the truth." The room turned toward her. Helen looked pale. Very pale. Then she continued. "Richard never reviewed that authorization personally." Charles immediately snapped. "Careful. Big mistake." Because now everyone was looking at him again. Then Helen took a deep breath. "I always wondered why the approval was rushed." Another pause. "Now I know." My stomach tightened, because suddenly the pieces were starting to fit together. Then Michael nodded slowly. "Charles forged the circumstances." Silence. "Not the signature." Another pause. "The information surrounding it." Victoria stared at Charles. "You manipulated my father." Charles rolled his eyes. "I saved the company." Nobody liked that answer. Then Michael laughed bitterly. "No." Another pause. "You stole it." Complete silence. Then Michael held up another document. My pulse exploded immediately, because this one looked older. Much older. Then the camera zoomed in. Last will and testament of Michael Sterling. The missing will. The will everyone thought had been hidden inside the archive. The ballroom erupted. Richard stared at the screen. Victoria gasped. Helen closed her eyes. Then Charles looked genuinely afraid. For the first time all night. Then Michael smiled slightly. "Looking for this?" Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Michael continued. "I removed it from the archive 15 years ago." My stomach dropped, because suddenly the break-in made sense. There had never been a will in the vault. Then Michael looked directly at Charles. "You spent 15 years searching for something I already had." The room froze. Charles's face lost all color. Then Michael opened the document. "Should I read it?" Silence. Complete silence. Then Richard nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes. "Please." Michael took a breath, then began reading. "In the event of my death or disappearance." Another pause. "All voting shares, private assets, and future inheritance rights shall be transferred to a protected beneficiary identified only by possession of the Sterling Valor Medal." The ballroom froze. My pulse stopped. Ethan slowly looked down at the metal hanging around his neck, then back at the screen. Then Michael continued. The metal shall serve as proof of trust and succession. Silence. Complete silence. Then Victoria whispered, No. Another pause. No way. Michael nodded slowly. Way. Then he looked directly at Ethan. For the first time all night, a smile appeared on his face. Warm. Genuine. Familiar. I gave that medal away. Another pause. To save a life. My stomach tightened. Then Ethan whispered, What? Michael took a deep breath. The night before the ferry explosion. Another pause. I met a young woman carrying a sick infant. The room froze. Then Michael smiled sadly. She had nowhere to go. Another pause. No money. Another pause. No help. My pulse accelerated. Because somehow I already knew where this was going. Then Michael continued. The baby needed emergency surgery. Silence. I couldn't save everyone. Another pause. But I could save one child. Then he looked directly at Ethan. Tears filled his eyes. That child was you. Complete silence swallowed the ballroom. Then Victoria slowly sat down. Grace covered her mouth. Richard started crying again. My own vision blurred. Then Ethan whispered, You knew? Michael nodded. For years. Another pause. I watched from a distance. Silence. Why didn't you come back? The question hung in the air. Then Michael's smile disappeared. Completely. Because suddenly I wasn't thinking about scholarships. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about all the nights I'd found him studying long after midnight, all the weekends he'd sacrificed. All the opportunities he'd never had. Maybe one finally showed up. Then something else fell out of the envelope. A second card. Formal. Gold lettering. Invitation for Ethan Carter and one guest. Attendance required at the Sterling Grand Hotel. Black tie attire. Saturday evening. Ethan looked at me. He slowly turned toward Charles Whitmore. The room followed his gaze. Then Michael delivered the sentence that changed everything again. Because the people who tried to kill me. Another pause. Were still running Sterling Industries. The ballroom froze. Then a new voice echoed through the speakers. Calm. Female. Dangerous. Not anymore. Every screen flickered. A new live feed appeared. Federal agents storming Sterling Tower. Offices being searched. Computers seized. Executives detained. Then the lead agent looked directly into the camera. Charles Whitmore. Silence. You're under arrest. The room exploded into chaos. The ballroom exploded into chaos. Federal agents stormed through every entrance. Guests rushed aside. Reporters practically climbed over each other trying to capture the moment. My pulse hammered against my ribs, because standing in the center of it all was Charles Whitmore, the man who had spent 15 years controlling Sterling Industries from the shadows, the man who had just watched his entire world collapse. Then the lead federal agent entered the ballroom holding a warrant. Charles Whitmore. Silence. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder. Complete silence followed. Charles stared at the document, then laughed. Softly, calmly, almost sadly. The reaction immediately worried me. Because innocent people panic, guilty people run, dangerous people laugh. Then Charles slowly adjusted his tie. You think this changes anything? Nobody answered. Then federal agents moved forward. Charles didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even look surprised. Instead, he looked toward the giant screen where Michael Sterling still appeared. You should have stayed dead. The ballroom froze. Michael stared back at him. You first. For the first time all night, several people actually laughed, even some of the agents. Then Charles's expression darkened. The mask finally slipped. You have no idea what you've done. Silence. Actually, Michael replied, I do. Another pause. I just ended your career. The agents grabbed Charles's arms. Cameras flashed everywhere. Then something unexpected happened. Charles smiled. Again. My stomach tightened immediately. Because somehow he still looked confident. Then he delivered the sentence that stopped everyone cold. You think I'm the problem. Silence. Complete silence. Then he looked directly at Richard Sterling. Tell them about Harbor 7. The room froze. Richard's face instantly lost all color. Victoria noticed immediately. "Dad?" Richard didn't answer. Then Charles laughed. "There it is." Another pause. That look. My pulse accelerated, because suddenly the old billionaire looked terrified. Then Charles turned toward the cameras. "Ask Richard Sterling what happened at Harbor 7. Silence. Ask him where the money came from." Another pause. "Ask him who disappeared." Federal agents immediately pulled him toward the exit, but the damage was done. Reporters started shouting questions. Victoria looked confused. Grace looked confused. Even Michael looked confused. Then Charles raised his voice one final time. "You arrest me today." Another pause. "And Sterling Industries dies tomorrow." The ballroom erupted again. Then the doors closed behind him. Just like that, Charles Whitmore was gone. Yet somehow the room felt more dangerous than before. Then silence settled over the crowd. Richard slowly sat down. His hands were shaking. Victoria moved toward him immediately. "Dad." Silence. "What's Harbor 7? The old billionaire closed his eyes. My stomach tightened, because he wasn't denying it. Then Michael appeared on the screen again. I knew he'd use that. Silence. "Use what?" Victoria asked. Michael sighed heavily. "The one thing Father never wanted exposed." Complete silence. Then Helen Cross whispered, "No." Michael nodded slowly. "Yes." Another pause. "Harbor 7. The room froze. Then Richard finally spoke. His voice barely worked. 40 years ago." Another pause. "Sterling Industries almost went bankrupt. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed." Then Richard continued. "We had one ship." Another pause. "One contract." Another pause. "One chance to survive." The ballroom remained silent. Then he looked toward Victoria, and I made the worst decision of my life. My pulse accelerated, because the guilt in his voice sounded real. Then Helen stepped forward. "Richard." He shook his head. "No." Another pause. "It's time." Then at the card. Then back at me. "Black tie?" I groaned immediately. "That's expensive." Ethan laughed. "Very expensive." We both knew neither of us owned anything remotely appropriate for a billionaire gala. Then Ethan's eyes drifted toward the silver medal hanging around his neck. He wore it every day. Had worn it for as long as I could remember. A small military medal attached to a faded chain. The medal was old, scratched, worn smooth in places. The old billionaire slowly stood. Then he looked around the ballroom, at the reporters, at the agents, at his family, finally at Ethan. Then he delivered the truth. Harbor 7 wasn't a port. Silence. Complete silence. Then he whispered. It was a prison. The room froze. Every hair on my neck stood up. Victoria stared at him. What? Richard looked devastated. 40 years ago, Sterling Industries signed a government contract. Another pause. A secret one. Another pause. We transported political prisoners. The ballroom exploded. Reporters shouted. Cameras flashed. Grace looked sick. Victoria staggered backward. Then Richard continued. I told myself it was legal. Another pause. I told myself it was necessary. Tears filled his eyes. I was wrong. Complete silence followed. Then Michael's voice came through the screen. Charles discovered the records years ago. Another pause. That's how he controlled you. Suddenly everything made sense. The blackmail, the manipulation, the fear. Then a federal agent's phone rang. He answered. Listened. Then his expression changed immediately. What? Silence. When? Another pause. How many? My pulse accelerated. Then the agent slowly lowered the phone. We have a problem. Nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at Richard Sterling. Someone just broke into Harbor 7's archives. Complete silence. Then another agent rushed into the ballroom carrying a tablet. Sir. He handed it over. The lead agent looked at the screen. His face instantly lost all color. Then he turned it toward everyone. My blood turned to ice. Because a live security feed filled the display. A massive underground archive. Rows of old documents, vaults, servers, history. And standing in the center of it all was a woman. Dark coat, silver hair, calm smile. Helen Cross. The family attorney. The woman standing only a few feet away from us. The ballroom froze. Slowly. Very slowly. Everyone turned toward Helen. She didn't run. Didn't panic. didn't even look surprised. Instead, she smiled. Then she said the one thing nobody expected. Finally. Complete silence. Then she looked directly at Richard Sterling. You should have burned everything when I told you to. The ballroom froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Every eye locked onto Helen Cross, the trusted attorney. The woman who had spent 40 years protecting the Sterling family. The woman standing calmly in front of a live security feed showing someone who looked exactly like her breaking into Harbor 7's archives. My pulse hammered in my ears. Richard Sterling looked devastated. Helen. Silence. Complete silence. Helen smiled sadly. Hello, Richard. Victoria stared at her. What is happening? Nobody answered. Then the giant screen flickered again. The security footage zoomed closer. The woman inside Harbor 7's underground archive was unmistakable. Same face, same voice, same silver hair. Yet Helen Cross hadn't moved from the ballroom, which meant only one thing. There were two of them. The realization hit the room like a bomb. Then Grace whispered, "No way." Helen nodded slowly. Actually, another pause. Yes, my stomach tightened immediately. Then Helen looked toward Richard. You never told them about Hannah. Complete silence followed. Richard closed his eyes. No. Another pause. I didn't. Victoria stared at her father. Who is Hannah? Helen answered herself. My sister. The ballroom froze again. Then she pointed toward the screen. Helen Cross. Another pause. Hannah Cross. Another pause. Twins. Suddenly, everything became much more complicated. Then the woman inside Harbor 7's archive looked directly into a security camera, smiled, and waved. The room collectively stopped breathing. Then Hannah spoke through the camera feed. Good evening, everyone. My blood turned to ice. Because unlike Helen, Hannah looked happy. Very happy. Then she turned toward the massive archive behind her. Rows of documents, vaults, historical records, decades of secrets. I've spent 15 years looking for this room. Silence, complete silence. Then Victoria stepped forward. Why? Hannah laughed softly. Because Richard Sterling isn't the only person with something to lose. My pulse accelerated. Then Richard whispered, Don't. Hannah ignored him. 40 years ago, Harbor 7 transported political prisoners. Another pause. That's true. Another pause. But that wasn't the real cargo. The room froze. Every reporter immediately started recording. Then Hannah opened a metal file cabinet, removed a thick folder,